We're on Daf Ayin Tes, and yesterday we saw the Mishnah, which is about 2/3 of the way down the Amud, and we started the Gemara. So let's go over the Tanur Rabbanan in the Gemara, which you'll see right after the Mishnah, about 2/3 of the way down the Amud. Haresha Hayu Yisrael Tmeim, V'Kohanim Uklei Shareis Tahorim. The Bryce is enumerating the various scenarios in which we bring the Karban Bituma, the Karban Pesach Bituma. First scenario is where the Kahal, the people of Israel, are Tmeim, and the Kohanim and the Klei Shareis. Klei Shareis is a reference to the knives that they use to do the Shechita and the Mizrakim that they use for Kabbalah Saddam and Zrika Saddam, Tahorim. Oh, in the second scenario, Ha Yisrael Tahorim, but Kohanim u Klei Shareis Tmeim, either the Kohanim are Tmeim or the Klei Shareis are Tmeim. And in all these cases, Yasu B'Tuma, they bring the Karban Pesach B'Tuma, She'ein Karban Tzibur Chaluk. So we'll see what the word Chaluk means in just a minute. But first, let's talk about the case where most of the Kohanim and the Klei Shareis that are necessary for the Asiyas HaPesach came Tmeim. And in the first case, opening this brisa was the Yisrael Atmeim, and that's Rov Yisrael. Now, we have a question here based on what we discussed yesterday, which I'd like to pick up as we start the Shia today. It seems that when we speak about Kohanim here in this Mishnah and Klei Shareis, Tmeim, we're talking about Rov. Yesterday, if you recall, we had a diuk in the Mishnah. The Mishnah only mentions Rov with regard to Kal, but when it got to the Kohanim, it said Kohanim Tmeim. How you Kohanim Tmeim? It didn't say Rov. And we made a big, gigantic deal about that. And we derived the conclusion that in the case of Kohanim Tmeim, we need that all the Kohanim are Tmeim. So how can we say here in this brisa, as the commentaries insist, that when it says Kohanim Tmeim, it means Rov Kohanim Tmeim? And this is the question that's asked by the Zevach Toda and other Achronim. Rabbi Chafetz Chaim asks this question as well in his Likutei Halachos. And they suggest the following, that when we said in the Mishnah that it's only Nitmu Kol HaKohanim, and then we do the Karban B'Tumah, but Rov is not enough, there we're talking about a case where the Miut Kohanim would be enough for serving most of Klal Yisrael. So that, let's say you had 100 Kohanim, all told, and let's say 10 of them were Tahorim, so only 90 out of 100 were Tmeim. In such a case, if those 10 Kohanim Tahorim could carry the burden of all of Israel, as far as somebody can help me with this technology, I keep pressing over and over again, mute all, and it doesn't work for me. I don't know why.
Steve,
No, I'm just trying to figure it out because it's not just relevant to this particular occasion. I don't know. Can't figure that out. In any event, so again, you have a case of miut kohanim tahorim, and we said in that case you don't bring the Karban B'Tumah. The reason for that is because we can suffice with that miut. So for the masses of Jews that have to bring their Karban Pesach, this cluster of kohanim, we'll call it a chabur of 10 kohanim, or tahorim, they are sufficient. They can carry the burden and bring the Karban, the Maisa Asiyas HaKarban, on behalf of all of Klal Yisrael. When we get to the Brisa, though, here we're talking about a case where ein miut tahorim bichdei sorech of Rov Yisrael. The small number of Kohanim, we called it a group of 10, would not be able to carry the burden of bringing the Korban Pesach on behalf of most of Klal Yisrael. And therefore, since Nitmu Rov Kohanim, and we need them badly for the Asiyas HaKarban, we're going to have to rely on the Tmeim, who make up the Rov of Kohanim, in order to facilitate the Avas HaKarban for most of Klal Yisrael. And in such a case, we're going to bring the Korban B'tumah, even though there's a group of Kohanim that remain Tahorim, but the burden for most of Klal Yisrael would not be able to be carried by this miyut of Kohanim. And that's what the Bryce is addressing here when it says that Kohanim Tmeim, which means Rov Kohanim Tmeim. And yet the Korban will be brought to Tumah because the miyut Kohanim Tahorim could not possibly carry the burden of the Korban Pesach on behalf of Rov Yisrael. Now, he has a comment here on the next part of the Mishnah, which says, next part of the Bryce, excuse me, which says, Yasu B'tumah, okay, that we understand. And that means that all the members of the Tzibur will bring the Korban B'tumah, even the Tahorim. We're not going to go out of our way to try to set up a Korban Pesach B'tara on behalf of the Tahorim, because once the Torah allowed this Korban to be brought B'tumah, then even the Tahorim will get a Korban Pesach B'tumah. So that, let's say, for example, the Kohanim Atmeim, and that's going to be Matami the Basar, let's say, then even the Tahorim amongst Klal Yisrael will eat from that Korban Pesach that's Tameh. Because again, once we've crossed the boundary lines and we're into the entity of Korban Pesach B'tumah, then even the Tahorim will participate in the Korban Pesach B'tumah. Then the Brisa says, Lefisha ein Korban Tzibur ba B'tumah chaluk. Chaluk means that we're not going to make any distinctions in terms of the Maisa of the Karban, in this case of Tumah, than we would if it was brought B'tara. And he comments here, Shechelkam Yasua B'tumah v'chelkam Yasua B'tara. We're not going to make a different kind of thing. We're going to say, you know what? We're going to have one Asiya, which is going to be B'tara, and we're going to do that with the Miyut Kohanim Tahorim. And we're going to have another run of the Korban Pesach B'tumah, because we don't have enough Kohanim to go around. So we're going to use the Kohanim Tmeim. Or we're going to say that for the sake of Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, who are members of Klal Yisrael that are Tar, we're going to try to use the Kohanim Torah. All these distinctions and juggling acts in order to get both Tumah and Tara, meaning Tumah when it's absolutely impossible otherwise, and there's no other option, and Tara when there is an option. All those distinctions are not going to be made. Once we got the green light, we go ahead and we bring the Korban B'tumah exactly as we would bring it B'tara. We don't ask which Kohen, we don't ask which Yisrael. The Korban Zeh Ba B'tumah, then we don't care about the Yechidim. You might have minority people who are Tahorim. You may have minority Kohanim with Tahorim. All those distinctions are irrelevant. Now, when the Brisa says that you have Klishares Tmeim, so we mentioned the Sakinim, the knives that are used for Shechita, and they contracted Tumah. And the Shochet, who's going to use this knife B'tumah, has to enter into the Azara. We don't have enough time on Erev Pesach with all the massive amounts of karbanos to try to get ourselves a very long knife so that the Shochet is Tameh, will stand outside the Azara and El Shecht inside the Azara with this long knife. Or, for example, another option would be he would have to wear gloves or something like that when he does the Shechita, and that would be a Chatzitza. Forget about all that. All that is not relevant because it's a Pesach Hanasa B'tumah. And a Pesach Hanasa B'Tumah means that we will shech the Korban Pesach with a sakin that's Tmeya, and we're going to allow for a Kohen who is Tomei to enter into the Azor. Into the Azor. Something that normally would incur a Chiyuv Kares, all that is suspended. So that if you have Shochtim who are Tmeim, they will go into the Azor to do the Shechita. We're not going to try to find a way of circumventing the Tumah and the entry into the Azor by using a long knife, etc., etc. Kolshkem, im nitu mizrakim. Now, the mizrak, which is otherwise known as a kos, that's for Kabbalas Hadam. That has to be in the Azor. There's no way that you can engineer it and have a Tomei outside the Azora being Makabal Adam with some sort of a. He says, Im nitnu amizrachim, hakabol vazrika heim avodas kahuna, heim nasos betuma. So these avodos of Kabbalas Adam, Zrikas Adam will be done betuma. They have to be done by the Kohanim inside the Azora. Shechita is not an avoda of Kohanim, it's kshera, both bizarre and even bizarre Tomei. V'nitmu asakinim, asiyas hatuma, ena el mishum knisa lazora betuma. So what we mean when we say that if the sakinim are tmeim, they contracted tuma, then we're not going to postpone the Korban Pesach or anything like that. We'll do the Korban Pesach betuma. And what it means by betuma means that we're going to enter into the Azara. Even though, again, there would be a theoretical possibility of engineering it in such a way that the shochet who's Tomei would not have to enter into the Azara, we have no hesitations. This is called a Korban Haba Betum. Now, Tosfos, Dibra Maskal Betuma, writes that there's not enough time to bring sakinim acherim. These are the sakinim that we have. You could send a messenger and knock on doors and bring from Yenim, from somewhere else, sakinim torim. All that is not necessary. And we're not going to look for replacement klishares, new ones that were not makabel tuma. Ein tzarech lasos chadoshim, and Rabbeinu Yonasan, one of the Rishonim, is quoted as saying, "You know what? Wait a second. Maybe if tuma b'chuya b'tzibur, maybe we could manufacture kelim chadoshim. Let's get a new knife or a new mizrak, and it's tar." He says that we're talking about a case of Erev Pesach Shechal Lios B'Shabbos, the Efshal Lasos Chadoshim. That's not the simple pshat here in this sugya. Here we're talking about Kohanim Tahorim that can do the bring the Korban B'Tumah because the Klisharis are Tmeim, and we're not suggesting or requiring on a weekday that we produce new kelim. So this whole premise here of Rabbeinu Yonasan needs explanation. Now, Nikar Adovar, listen to this, Shatahorim Nizharim Me'atmeim. He says that if we would require that the Tahorim remain tar, he says, Hu Gnai Latmeim. It's interesting, this is very relevant to contemporary life. I stay away from you because you're tummy, right? I distance myself. He says that's a gnai for the tmeyu. Shenira, it's as if they're sending a message. Rashi says, "Sha'osim betuma be'isakaris." You're like, what are you doing here in the Azara, participating in the Karmon? That's an isakaris for a tummy. So the Tahorim are instructed not to be careful about tuma. This is an interesting quiz question. You wake someone up in the middle of the night and tell me under what circumstances do we tell a tar to enter into the Azara and not to be careful about Tumah in the Azara? And the answer is Pesach haba b'Tumah. So don't even avoid Tumah. Don't say, "Oh, I'm going to stay away from the Tmeim." That's going to be a gnai for the Tmeim, as if to imply, what are you doing in the Azara? Which means that you're violating an Isakaris. And the Meiri goes a step further. He writes, "Yesh isur lihizoyer mituma ba'asiyas hapesach." We are enjoined from being careful. This is like the famous, I'm sure you're familiar with the Yerushalmi and Nazir, that if a Kohen has to be metame to one of his close relatives, and the Yerushalmi tells the story about one of the Kohanim, he's passing by the bier, the corpse, and he stayed away. So the Kohanim pushed him to be metame himself. And the Rav used to say that the kiyum of his kedushas kahuna is to be machal his kedushas kahuna. That's the mitzvah that's imposed upon him because of the mitzvah of tumah in the case of the Zion Grove. Here also, very, very similar to what the Rav was saying there, we have over here that the Meiri is saying that it's also to be nizar b'tumah in the Azara, which is normally an Isakaris. It's bad enough for Kohen contracts tumah, but a tummy in the Azara? No. Yesh isur lizar mituma b'asiyas hapesach. Now, the Brisa says, "Ein karban tzibur chaluk," and what the Brisa is trying to explain here by adding these 4 words is, why are we doing this karban b'tumah even with regard to the tahorim? Meaning, you have rov at tzibur tmeim, you have miut at a tahorim, and yet we're going to do it in a way that is completely oblivious to their tara. We're not going to ask them in any way, shape, or form to try to be makbid, to be careful that it's done b'tara. And that applies, number 1, in the case of miut Yisrael tahorim. Number 2, it's going to apply in the case of miut kohanim tahorim, or in a case of miut klei shares tahorim. In all those cases, we're not going to try to do what we can to implement a Maisa Korban Pesach B'Tara. That's what this Brisa means by saying Ein Korban Tzibur Chaluk. We're going to go through imitate the motions, in this case of a Korban B'Tumah, that we would do if it was B'Tara, without any hesitations whatsoever. So again, there's no zehirus here that the avodah should be done v'tara, to the extent that we have tahorim here, kohanim tahorim, or Yisrael tahorim. It is a carbon that is brought b'tum. Now we have the sugya of Rav Chizda. Rav Chizda is going to limit the application of this brisa in a case where the carbon is brought to Tumah as a result of the fact that the klishares are tmei. And the Brisa said that if the Klisharis are Tmeim, then the Pesach is Ba B'Tumah. Everyone is going to bring a B'Tumah. Even though, again, the situation is that Rov Hatzibur Tahor. It's only a mute of the call that it's Tmeim, but nevertheless it's going to be brought B'Tumah. And we're not going to push it off to Pesach Sheni. And why is that? Because the Kalim are Tmeim. The Klei Shares are Tmeim. And Rav Chiz is going to tell you that's not always the case. In other words, it's not always an absolute rule that if the Klisharis are Tmeim, then we will bring the carbon B'Tumah. Omer Rav Chiz. Lo Shanu, this halacha that we are Oseh Esa Pesach B'Tumah, Ela Shenitma Hasakin Bitmei Mes. Now, I would just add one point of introduction, which we'll clarify as we go along, that a Rishon L'Tumah is not Mitame Adam V'Kelim. So let's say, for example, a person comes in contact with a sheretz, and now he becomes a Rishon L'Tumah. That's totally different than if he came in contact with a corpse, with a mess, or even with someone who contracted tumah from a mess. Because in the case of mess, we're dealing with, I'm not talking the mess himself, but I'm saying those who came in contact with the mess, or those who came in contact with others who came in contact with the mess. There you're entering into what we call the Av HaTumah realm, and in certain cases even higher than that, Aviavos HaTumah, as we'll see when we get to the principle of Cherev Harei Kechol. But in the case of and that means that if such a person who came in contact with a corpse, or with a person who came in contact with the corpse, would come in contact now with the sakin, with a kli, is a rishon, an avatum is mitame other v'kelim. I'm putting the emphasis now on kelim. So an avatuma, if he comes in contact with the kli, he transmits tumah to the kli. So when we're talking about a kli sharetz, like a sakin, that contracted tumah, and we're going to bring the carbon tumah, we're talking about a sakin that came in contact either with the mess himself, with the mess itself, that's already aviyavos tumah, or with someone who came in contact with the mess, who's a tummy mess, and his status is that of an avatuma, and an avatuma is mitame other v'kelim, so that this shechting knife, this sakin shel shchita, is now tummy. But if the sakin shel shchita came in contact with a rishon l'tumah, then a rishon l'tumah is mitame ochlu mashkin, but not other v'kelim. So the sakin would not be tummy when it came in contact with a rishon l'tumah. And that's pretty much what Rav Chizda wants to emphasize. That Amar Rav Chizda lo shanu el shenitma asakin bit tamei mes, which means with a person who came in contact with a mess. Because a person who comes in contact with a mess is an avatum, and he's mitami kelim. The Rachmana Amar. Okay, so now let's read the whole pasuk. And we're going to focus our attention on two words out of the pasuk, but let's read the whole pasuk. And this is in the parsha of Chukas of Tumas Mes. It says there, "B'chol asher yiga al pnei hasadeh, b'chalal cherev yitma shivas yomim." And we have here, I may have skipped two words. Let me read it again. V'chol asher yiga al pnei hasadeh b'chalal cherev o b'mes. So we have here cherev and mes in the same breath. is hikish cherev lemes. Cherev hareu kechol. Chol is the corpse, and the cherev has the same status as the corpse itself. The corpse is called aviyavos hatuma, and now the cherev becomes an aviyavos hatuma. Now again, we're talking about a cherev. A cherev is a classic, is a password for a kli mateches, and this does not apply to a kli eitz, a wooden keli, but noga mateches, a kli mateches b'mes, harei hit mea kamosa, which means hames atzmo aviyavos hatuma v'af hamateches shenoga ba aviyavos hatuma ukmochen mateches shenoga b'tmei mes. The tmei mes is an av hatuma, and now the mateches that comes in contact with the av hatuma, who's tmei mes, becomes like the av hatuma, and he himself is an av hatuma. In other words, this defies and undermines all the klolim of Tumah V'Tara. Because in Tumah V'Tara, when B contracts Tumah from A, B is a lower level of Tumah than A. So if a Sheni comes in contact with the Rishon, it's a Sheni, it's etc., etc. Here's a case where it doesn't go down a level, where the Kli Mateches receives the same status of Tumah as the Tomei Mes himself. The Tomei Mes is an Ava Tumah, and the Kli Cheres, and the Cherev, which the Kli Mateches, is likewise an Ava Tumah. So Tomei Mes, who comes in contact with a Kli Mateches, transmits the status of an Ava Tumah to that Kli Mateches. And this is Exeris HaKosuv. It has no parallel anywhere in the entire constellation of Hilchos Tumah V'Tar of Taros, because we always go down a Madrega, with the exception of Tumas Mes vis-a-vis a Kli Mateches. Therefore, once the Kli Mateches, which is called in the biblical Hebrew a Cherev, has been come in contact with a Tomei Mes and now became an Ava Tumah, then an Ava Tumah is Mitame Adam V'Kelim, is Komitame Legavra, when the person picks up this knife and he shechts the carbon with this knife, the person himself becomes Tomei. Deme ikara kimus aved bitumas aguf de karis kamis aved. Meaning that if this cherev, this sakin, came in contact with either the mes or a tomei mes that touched the sakin, now the shochet who uses this sakin, from the very beginning of his Masechet Shchita, it's a carbon tumah that's being brought to tumas aguf. And what kind of tumas aguf? It's a tumas aguf of kares. Kares means that it's a severe enough level of tumah that if he enters into the Azara, he will be chayav kares for that. And yet, as Rav Chiz is pointing out, the Torah says tumah d'chuya b'tzibur, so that now you can have a shochet who's using a sakin that came in contact with a mes or a tomei mes and has the status of an avatuma, and fine, go ahead and shech the carbon. Now, what's the status of the Adam who's shechting the carbon? And the answer is that since the cherev, the sakin, became an avatum is mitami on the mekalim. So the shochet himself now is tummy by virtue of the fact that he came in contact with an avatum, meaning the cherev is the avatum. Now, by entering into the Azara, Rav Chisda points out he's chayiv karetz, but yet the Torah says tuma dechuya b'tzibur, and tuma dechuya b'tzibur means that we're going to be docha the isa tuma on Pesach, and once we do so, it's nidcha legamre. The dechia is complete, and therefore yasvus haPesach bein b'tahorim bein b'tmeim. Even the tahorim will bring the carbon b'tuma without any distinction, because it's a carbon that's docha tuma. So you don't have to be concerned about tuma; it's docha tuma. Says Rav Chisda, avol nitma sakim b'tuma sheretz. Now, what happens with a sheretz that comes in contact with Adam or Kalim? The Adam or the Kalim become a rishon l'tuma. Is the basar who metamula? The basar, which had contact with the sakin when he shechted the animal, the basar becomes tameh, but gavra lo metameh. The shochet doesn't become tameh. Why? Because the shochet came in contact with that kli that came in contact with the sheretz. The kli itself becomes a rishon l'tuma, and the gavra who's using this sakin that came in contact with the sheretz is now going to be a sheni l'tuma. That's called gavra lo metamele. The shochet himself is not nitma. Oh, I said to you, I'm sorry, I had a plitas pez. He said, I said to you that the shochet becomes a sheni l'tuma. Forget about that. The shochet does not contract any tumah whatsoever, because a rishon l'tuma can only be tami ochler mashkin and not on the mekalim. So the shochet who came in contact with a knife that came in contact with a sheretz is tar. And that's what he calls legavra lo metamila. Is therefore tahorim avid, tmeim lo avid. We do not have that full-fledged status of a carbon sheba b'tuma. Why? Because the kli, in this case, is a rishon l'tuma and not an avatum. That's the thrust of Rav Chisda. The bottom line of Rav Chisda is when you talk about a carbon abal b'tuma as a result of the kalim, that means that the kalim had a status of an avatum, which means they kalim came in contact with either a mess or the tummy mess. But if the contact of the kli was with a sheretz, and there was no contact with a mess, then the kli itself, the sakin, is a rishon l'tuma that cannot impart tuma neither to an adam nor to the kalim. So there's no problem in bringing this carbon b'tara. What do you mean bringing the carbon b'tara? This sakin is a rishon l'tuma. It came in contact with the sheretz. If you're going to use this sakin, then you're using something that has a a status as an object, a kli that's tamid? The answer is no. It's not tamid. Why? Because it cannot be metame the gavra. What we need in order, in other words, Rav Chiz's point is that kalim betuma generate a carbon above betuma, but only because those kalim are tmeim. Those kalim are such tmeim. They have such a darga of tuma that they can impart tuma on the gavra who is using that keli to shech the carbon pesach. But if the tuma of the keli was on a lower level, it's a rishon l'tuma, and it cannot impart tuma neither to Adam to kalim. Then the shochet who goes ahead and takes this knife that's a rishon l'tuma because it had contact with the sheretz, and he shechs the carbon pesach, he himself is tar. So it comes out that according to Rav Chizda, in this case of a sakin that came in contact with what? With a sheretz, it's a pesach above b'tara, which means the tmeim have to wait till the Yudalid BIyun. Why? Because the kalim, says Rav Chizda, to justify a carbon above tuma, have to be capable of conveying tuma to the gavra, which means that we come back to, the tuma of Rovat Tzibur. And that would only be possible if this sakin came in contact either with a mess, cherev hareu kachol, or alternatively with a tummy mess, because then the sakin gets the status of an avatuma, which can convey tuma to other kalim. So the shochet who's going to use this knife that came in contact with the tummy mess or with the mess, now he contracts tuma. And why does the shochet contract tuma? Because an avatuma can be mitame other kalim. Why is this kli an avatuma? That's exeris hakosov. Any kli mateches, when we're talking about a sakin, that came in contact with the tummy mess or with the mess itself, gains the same exact status. It says, Tahorim Ovid, Tmeim Lo Ovid. So Tmeim have to bring a carbon Pesach on Pesach Sheni. Mutav Shei Achel Betumas Basar Bilav, the Alye Achel Basar Betumas Haguf Shehu Bekaretz. So this we have to understand. Mutav Shei Achel Betumas Basar. Now I got it. Because a rishon l'tuma is mitame ochlenu mashki, and the sakin that came in contact with the sheretz is a rishon l'tuma, and that sakin, when it cuts the basar, conveys to the basar a status as a sheni l'tuma. How does a rishon make a sheni? Because the answer is a rishon cannot be mitame out of a kalim, but it can be mitame ochlenu mashki. So the basar, the pesach, the Torah's ochlin, will now contract tuma when it comes into contact with a rishon l'tuma, meaning with a knife that came in contact with the sheretz. So the Torah in this case is going to allow tuma's basar Why? Because the alternative is tumas haguf, which is an isakaris. Now, what does that mean? That the alternative This I don't understand. Just give me 1 minute. Mutav sheyochel betumas basar, shabasar tameh, adam ha'ochel tahar, and that's an isur lav. The al ye'achel basar betumas haguf shehu b'karis, meaning what? That if we were to bring this carbon betuma, and that would mean that even the tmeim could eat even the tmeim could eat the basar. So again, when a tahar eats basar tameh, that's a violation of a law. But when a tameh eats basar kachim, that's an isakaris. How do we know such a thing? Ha'ochel min hakachim kishehu tameh, which is what it means when we have a pesach haba b'tuma, chayv karis. Shenemar vayikar zayin v'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlomet shel Lashem v'tumas olav v'nichras la'nefesh hahi me'amer. Now, there's a sugya in Zvachim, a machlokas shin chachamim and Rabbi Yossi Glili. What if he himself is tameh? He's eating basar kachim b'tuma, which we said is a chiv karis, but he himself is tameh. And the chachamim say he's still included in the isur karis. The fact that he's tameh doesn't exonerate him. But Rabbi Yossi Glili says he's pot. All right, so that's a sugya in the Masechet Zvachim. You really have to know what we're learning today is the overlap between kachim and taros, both very esoteric areas of Torah knowledge, especially taros. So he writes here the following: Adam tar ha'ochel basar kachim tameh. So again, this is not the case of the tameh eating kachim. The tameh eating kachim is an isur kares, but now we're talking about a case of a tar who's eating kachim that a tmeim, that's only a chiyuv malchus. And that's based on a pasuk that says, "Va'basa shayiga b'chol tameh lo yach." So it means that if the sakin is a rishon l'tumah because it came in contact with the sheretz, we're still going to, even though now what we said before is true, that a rishon l'tumah could convey tumah to ochlin, and now we're going to be eating basar tameh, but basar tameh, if it's eaten by tar, is only a lot. And the other option would be Pesach haba b'tumah. And Pesach haba b'tumah would imply that the Tmeim are eating basar kachim, which is an isur kares. So the Gemara is now indicating a kind of a balance, or you put things on a scale, and which is more chomer than which. You have on one side of the scale basar tameh, which contracted tumah from this sakin, because a rishon l'tumah is metame ochlin. And now you can have a tar eating basar tameh. That's the bottom line. Or what you're going to do is you're going to apply tumah to chuyav b'tzibur and bring this carbon b'tumah. Then the gavra becomes tameh. And if the gavra becomes tameh, whether the basar is tameh or not is irrelevant. It's basar kachim. That's a chiyuv kares. So we don't want to bring the carbon b'tumah to allow a gavra who's tameh to eat from kachim, because that would be a violation of isur kares. We would prefer to use the sakin for shchitas haPesach. Again, the sakin that is a rishon to become in contact with each other. And The worst case scenario is that as a result of the shechita, the basar becomes tameh, but the gaver is tar. If the gaver is tar and he eats basar tameh, he violates the law. There's no chiyuv kares. Now, I wanted to read to you a note here. If I could find it, just give me a minute. He says the following: a person who was contaminated by a corpse, that's what we call tummy mess, is in the category of an avatum. A knife or any metal utensil that is touched by a tummy mess attains the same level of an avatum, which means that that knife that came in contact with a tummy mess as an avatum can contaminate another person who touches it and also another kli. And what the Torah did by specifying a sword and mentioning it in the same breath with a body, right? When the Torah says, what's the entire posca shayiga bichalal cherev o b'mes? Mes is the body, and the halal cherev is the sword. It teaches us that the sword has the same status of tumah as the body, it acquires the same degree of tumah. So therefore, a metal utensil that comes in contact with a corpse is tameh and acquires the level of tumah of that source itself. And that is a unique rule that applies exclusively to tumas mes. Now, if a person is tameh and he enters into the mikdash, into the azara, or he eats kachim, then he's chayiv kares. The knife now contaminates the shochet because the knife came in contact with a mess or a tummy mess, and it's an avatuma, and now it's mitami the shochet. In such a case, we cannot allow a minority of the people to do the shechita on behalf of others, since the minority would then be liable to kares for remaining in the temple, in the kodesh, while he's tameh. So we have now a tumah that's conveyed from the sakin to the shochet, and the shochet, as we said before, is a tameh who's in the mikdash, and he incurs a chiyuv kares. The only way we could allow this to go on is in a case where the community itself became tmeim. He says the entire community. I'm not sure what he means by that. I think it's enough to have rov. And then we have the special dispensation for a korban tzibur that is brought b'tumah. And korban tzibur b'tumah overrides the severe iser kares of a tameh entering into the mikdash. But sheretz tumah, which is acquired through contact with a dead sheretz, namely any of the 8 categories of creeping creatures that you'll find in the parsha in Vayikra, Perek Yud Aleph. A sheretz is an avatum. When a knife comes in contact with a sheretz, the knife requires the status of a reduced tumah called a rishon l'tumah. A rishon l'tumah can contaminate ochlin, but not adam. Now, a tameh who eats kachim gets kares, as we said before. A tar who eats kachim tmeim is chayiv malchus. I mean, this is something that we have to allow to sink into our brains. Again, if a tameh eats kachim, he's chayiv kares. If a tar eats kachim tmeim, he's chayiv malchus. Since, okay, this is the punchline here. If we can get this, then since the community is in need of a dispensation only to override the relatively minor prohibition of eating sacred meat, meaning kachim, that's tameh b'tumah, that are tmeim. Therefore, the minority of people whose bodies are tameh and are subject to the more severe prohibition of kares have no license to participate in the Pesach service. In other words, again, what do you need to, why do you want to bring the korban b'tumah? It's because you don't want to eat kachim tmeim, right? Because the sakin, as a rishon l'tumah, was metami the basa. That's a relatively, what does he call it? I would call it a minor. Oh, excellent. He calls it a relatively minor prohibition. If we're going to bring the korban b'tumah, then we're going to violate a kares isur, because then we're going to have the tmeim eat the basar, and if the tmeim eat the basar, that's a chiv kares. So therefore, the Pesach is not bar b'tumah. Just to summarize, I mean, the bottom line of everything we're discussing, I mean, I apologize, but this has to be ironed out. Rav Chizd is saying that when the Brisa tells us that we will achieve and implement what's called a Pesach haba b'tumah, because the klei shares are tmeim, says Rav Chizd that's only in a case where the klei shares, meaning the sakin, by virtue of its contact with the tamei mes, achieved, I shouldn't say achieved, but assumed the status of an avatar. Then, in the case of an avatuma, the sakin is going to be mitame the shochet, because an avatum is mitame on a. So that's enough to justify a Pesach haba b'tumah, because all those who are going to use this sakin are going to come tmeim. If, on the other hand, the sakin came in contact with a sheretz and assumed the status of a rishon l'tum, it's not mitame yodam v'kelim. It'll only be mitame ochlin u'mashkin. In this case, it'll be mitame the basa. But a tar who eats basa kachim only violates a lav, which is relatively minor prohibition compared to Pesach haba b'tumah, because Pesach haba b'tumah means that the tmeim are going to eat the kachim, and that's an isur kares. So Rav Chizda says, don't even consider the possibility that if the sakin contracted tumah sheretz and it became a rishon l'tumah, that we're going to implement the whole kit and caboodle of a Pesach haba b'tumah. Because even if that sakin as a rishon l'tumah will convey tumah to the basar, a tar who eats the basar kachim violates maximum a chiv malchus, whereas Pesach haba b'tumah involves a tameh eating kachim, and a tameh eating kachim is an isur kares. Hey, Rav Osai, this is where we're going to stop for today. You know, I always find that now let me add that in the next Gemara, which we'll cover Mr. Shem more in depth next week, Rava says that even in the case where the Sakin contracted Tumah from Tumah Sheretz, and in which case only the Basar becomes Tummy, not the Gavra, Afilu Tmeim Nami Avdi. We're going to do a Pesach with the Tahorim, and my timer, the reason for this is the Chsiv, and there's going to be a very sophisticated Yalfusa from which Rav is going to derive that this carbon is going to be done even by the Tmeim. Even by the Tahorim, even though the Sakin contracted the status of a Rishon L'Tumah as a result of its contact with a Sheretz. And that's against Rav Chizda. Now, Loshan Mutav, you remember that Rav Chizda uses the word Mutav. Mutav she'achel betumas basar, shehu belav. He writes, Biuro, Loshan zu nemeres kasher boim livchar dover echad mitoch shnei dvarim, as I shokelim osam, ze keneged ze, liros mi adif, umi lahadif. V'al ha'adif, al ha'adif, right, we would say in modern Hebrew, mi beneim omrim mutav. Mutav livchar osam v'loas chaver. Ulam, however, kasher brera he livchar chisaran echad mitoch shnayim, Ofen shanidon kan she'im nidches tumas haguf is af tumas basar nidches. V'im nidches tumas basar lo nidches ima tumas haguf lo shaykh lo shem muta. Ivada yesh livchar chisaron echad levada. So the Achronim want to know that the application here of the word mutav is very difficult here, because in the case of nidches tumas basar, lo nidches ima tumas haguf. So that's not a question of mutav. You know, you have one chisaron, but not the other. There's no tumas haguf here, so why do you use the word mutav? He says, Bir ha'eteres chacham, one of the Achronim, shel Rav Chizda, im nidches tumas haguf, ein isur mishum tumas basar klal, ve'ena el dechia achas. Interesting. The tumas basar is completely ignored. It evaporates, so to speak. Lachein shaykh loshem mutav sheyitchet tumas basar hakalav lo tumas haguf hachamur. So we're not comparing two chisronis to one chisaron, but rather, according to Rav Chizda's understanding, there's no tumas basar relevant over here, and all that's relevant is tumas haguf. So now we're comparing tumas haguf to tumas basar. And tumas basar is kala, tumas guf is a tuma chamura, and therefore the word mutav is an appropriate term. We're not taking one chisaron as opposed to two. That wouldn't be mutav, but rather one chisaron against one chisaron. It's one against one. One is kala and one is chamura. Okay, then, so let's just make a note of where we got up to. The Rava Omar. And in Mirz Hashem, you know, next week we'll talk about the machlokas that we're going to learn between Rava and Rav Chizda.